Dust clung to the child's lashes as she knelt in the dirt, a crust of bread in one hand, her mother's fever-hot head in the other. The sky was a pale, washed-out gold. The sun was dying, and her mother was dying with it. Her mother stirred, cracked lips whispering a prayer that the wind stole before it could reach God. The girl tried to coax her to chew the bread, but her jaw was slack. Her fingers were grimy. Her hope was thinner than a cobweb. They had been walking for weeks, running from the coughing sickness in town, but it had followed them. It lived in her mother's lungs now, a rattling ghost. Bootsteps crunched on the hard ground. The girl stiffened, clutching the bread to her chest like a shield. A figure blocked the sun, a man as tall as the ranch gate, his face lost in the shadow of his hat brim. He was a giant cut from the dying light. "What are you doing out here, little one?" His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, but there was no malice in it. She swallowed the lump in her throat. She had to be brave. "Sir," she said, her voice a tiny thread, "if I sweep your floor, could we stay one night?" He didn't answer. He just pushed his hat back, and the sun caught the deep lines etched around his eyes. He looked from her to the woman lying broken in the dirt, then back to her. His gaze was heavy. It felt like it could weigh a soul. "You from town?" She shook her head. "Anybody expecting you?" Another shake. He let out a long, slow breath through his nose. It was the sound of wind through dead grass. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw something flicker in the shadow of his face. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to recognition. "Mom," he said, and the title made her stand a little straighter. "You're standing in God's country. Nobody ought to sleep cold here." He stooped, and with a grunt he lifted her mother as if she weighed no more than a sack of feed. The movement was so gentle it made the girl's heart ache. She scrambled to her feet, nearly tripping in her haste to follow the dark shape of the man carrying what was left of her world. He carried her to the nearest cabin. It stood apart from the others, isolated and silent. The windows were caked with so much dust you couldn't see in. Inside there was only a single cot, a small table, and a thick, suffocating emptiness. He laid her mother down on the thin mattress. The girl hovered in the doorway, a nervous colt ready to bolt. "You can sweep if you like," he said, his back to her. He set a bucket by the steps. "There's a broom inside." She darted in, her small hands closing around the broomstick like it was a holy relic. It was a promise she had made, a debt to be paid. She swept with a fierce, desperate energy, stirring up clouds of dust that danced like ghosts in the slanted evening light. She swept until the floorboards showed their pale, worn grain. She swept as if she could scrub the sickness and the sorrow right out of the room. Outside, the man sat on the porch rail of the main house across the yard, elbows on his knees, staring toward the darkening horizon. He didn't move. He just watched the night fall, as if waiting for it to swallow him whole. When she finished, the girl knelt beside her mother. Her breathing was a little easier now, a soft, steady rasp in the quiet cabin. A thin line of satisfaction crossed the girl's tired face. She had kept her word. From across the yard, the man said nothing, but as he rose to go inside his own house, she saw him leave something on their step, a tin dipper of water and a small loaf of coarse bread. He didn't look back. As dusk settled into a deep purple bruise, the girl gave her mother water, cradling her head. The woman murmured something that sounded like safe and drifted back into a restless sleep. The cabin was quiet, except for the breathing and the distant, lonely lowing of cattle. The girl sat cross-legged on the floor she had swept clean. Through a crack in the shutters, she watched the man saddle his horse. His silhouette moved against the fading sky, broad-shouldered and slow, as if he carried a weight that had nothing to do with work. She wanted to call out, to ask if they could stay another night if her mother wasn't well by morning, but her voice was trapped in her throat. He mounted the horse and rode out, not toward town but away, into the vast, swallowing darkness of the prairie. He rode like a man running from a memory. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, she crept to the doorway and sat on the top step. The air smelled of mesquite and dust and the sweet coolness of prairie grass. She looked up at the first stars pricking the black velvet sky. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to God or to the man on the horse. Behind her, her mother coughed, a raw, scraping sound that clawed at the silence. The girl's heart hammered against her ribs. She turned, terrified the fever had taken a turn, that the sickness was finally winning. She rushed back inside, her hands trembling as she knelt by the cot. But as she reached to touch her mother's forehead, she saw it. Something she hadn't noticed before. On the cot, tucked beside the thin blanket, was a folded scrap of cloth. A man's bandana. Its red faded to a soft rose color. It smelled of dust and saddle leather, the scent of the man who had brought them here. But that wasn't all. She held it to her face, breathing it in. And underneath the scent of the man, there was something else. A faint, sweet perfume, like lavender fields after a rain. It was a woman's scent. A chill crawled up her spine that had nothing to do with the night air. This wasn't just an empty cabin. Someone had lived here. Someone had left their scent behind. And the silence of the room suddenly felt heavy, watchful, haunted. Morning sunlight sliced through the shutters, painting golden stripes on the floor. The girl, Lydia, woke with a stiff neck, curled against her mother's side. For a disoriented moment, she forgot where they were. Then the smell of old wood and dust brought it all back. The tall man, the empty cabin, the ghost of lavender. Her mother's breathing was steadier, but her cheeks were still flushed with fever. Lydia sat up and crossed to the broom. She began to sweep again, the soft whisper of the bristles a comforting rhythm in the quiet room. It wasn't about payment anymore, it was about holding her small world together, one stroke at a time. A shadow fell across the doorway. She startled, clutching the broom handle like a weapon. "Easy," the man said. His voice was gentler this morning. He must have returned in the dead of night. "You've done a good job. This floor hasn't looked that clean in years." Lydia looked down, her cheeks hot, and kept sweeping. "You hungry?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Come on then." He stepped back, letting sunlight flood the threshold. She hesitated, glancing back at her sleeping mother. "She'll sleep a bit longer," he said, as if reading her mind. "Fever's not the kind that steals a body quick." The way he said it was strange, full of a certainty that felt old and worn. "Go on." She followed him out into the bright, bustling ranch yard. Roosters crowed, men led horses from the corral, smoke curled from the chimney of the main house. It was a world waking up, and she was a ghost in it. He handed her a tin plate with a wedge of cornbread and a thick slice of bacon. She sat on the porch step, the rough wood cool against her bare feet, and ate like she hadn't seen food in a year. "You got a name?" he asked after a while. She nodded, her mouth full. "You going to tell it?" "Lydia," she mumbled around a bite of cornbread. He nodded slowly. "I'm Ward." When she finished, she wiped her fingers on her skirt and stood up. "Can I sweep the porch too?" A quiet huffing sound escaped him. It might have been a laugh. "If you're set on it, I won't stop you." She worked while he saddled a fresh horse nearby. She could feel his eyes on her, watching the way she gripped the broom, the fierce concentration on her small face. She swept with the determination of someone trying to prove they belonged. Around mid-morning, the rattle of wagon wheels announced a visitor. A woman in a starched, severe bonnet climbed down, her mouth already pulled into a tight, disapproving line. "Ward," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "What's this I hear about you housing strangers?" "They needed a place, Mabel," Ward said, his voice flat. The woman's eyes swept over the cabin, the broom, and landed on Lydia, who stood clutching it like a shield. "Charity's fine for Sunday prayers," she snapped. "But you can't take in every lost soul that comes down the road, especially not here." The way she said "here" was filled with venom. Her eyes weren't just disapproving, they were full of a deep, burning hatred, and it was all directed at the little cabin. Lydia's shoulders tensed. She shrank back, trying to hide behind the doorframe. Ward's jaw tightened. "They ain't in my house. They're in the old bunk cabin. Not costing you a thing, Mabel." "The old bunk cabin." Mabel let out a laugh that was sharp and ugly. "Is that what you call it now?" She took a step closer, her gaze fixed on the cabin door. "You'll see, Ward. Give a stray a roof and they'll think they own the place. You'll regret letting them defile it." "Then that's between me and the Lord," Ward said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned his back on her, a clear dismissal. Mabel sniffed, her face a mask of fury, and climbed back into her wagon. Lydia's stomach was a tight knot of fear. She waited until the wagon had rattled out of sight before she spoke. "Do we got to leave?" she whispered. Ward turned to look at her, his face unreadable. "Not unless you want to." She shook her head, a fierce, desperate motion. That night, he left more than just bread and water. A crock of warm soup and a thick wool blanket appeared on the porch step. Lydia carried them inside, her heart pounding with a fragile, painful relief. Her mother woke enough to sip the broth. "Who gives us this?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. "The tall man." "Ward." Her mother's eyes softened, but then a flicker of worry crossed her face. "We can't stay forever, Lydia." "Just till you're better," Lydia insisted, tucking the warm blanket around her mother's shoulders. Later, when her mother was asleep again, Lydia crept to the door and peered out into the darkness. Across the yard, Ward sat on the porch rail of his own house, head in his hands. He was staring at their cabin. The lantern beside him cast long, dancing shadows, but it couldn't hide the raw grief in his posture. His spine was bowed, his shoulders slumped, as if under an invisible, crushing weight. Lydia watched him, a strange feeling stirring in her chest. He wasn't just a lonely man. He was a man in mourning. And his grief was aimed directly at the little cabin where she and her mother now slept. It was then she realized the truth. The lavender scent, the strange emptiness, Mabel's hatred, Ward's sorrow, it was all connected to this small, dusty room. They weren't just staying in an empty bunkhouse. They were sleeping in a tomb. By the third morning, the fever had broken. Lydia's mother sat on the edge of the cot, pale but upright, smoothing the wrinkles from her skirt with trembling fingers. Dignity was a hard thing to hold on to when you had nothing else left. Lydia laced her own worn boots, her heart thumping with a nervous energy. She wanted to show Ward she could work, that they wouldn't be a burden. He appeared in the doorway, the frame of his wagon silhouetted against the morning sun. "I'm headed into town," he said, his gaze on Lydia's mother. "You look strong enough for some fresh air." She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward Lydia. "I reckon so." Lydia's heart did a little jump. Town, the thought of streets and shops after so many weeks of empty, dusty roads, felt like a promise, like a dream. The ride was marked by the steady clop of hooves and the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels. The town wasn't much. A single dusty street lined with weathered buildings, a general store, a blacksmith's forge clanging away. But to Lydia, it was a metropolis. She stared, wide-eyed, at everything, trying to drink it all in. Ward tied the team to a hitching post. "I've got business at the livery," he said, not quite meeting their eyes. "You two get what you need." He pressed a few coins into her mother's hand. Lydia helped her mother down from the wagon. They walked toward the general store, their boots loud on the wooden boardwalk. A man tipped his hat as they passed, but the woman on his arm stared, her mouth pinched with the same sour disapproval Lydia had seen on Mabel's face. News traveled fast in a place this small. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco. Lydia trailed her fingers along a barrel of pinto beans, her eyes wide with wonder. Her mother was more practical, gathering a small parcel of tea and a single spool of black thread. At the counter, the storekeeper, a man with a heavy belly and suspicious eyes, looked them up and down. "You folks the ones staying on Ward's place?" Lydia's mother gave a single stiff nod. The man snorted, a soft, contemptuous sound. "Ward's got a big heart, too big if you ask me. Makes a man's head soft. He can't keep taking in every stray that wanders by, especially not with mouths to feed." Lydia froze. The word stray hit her like a slap. She stared at the man's thick, calloused hands as he counted out their change, feeling her face burn with shame. Her mother's spine went rigid. "We'll earn our keep," she said, her voice low but unwavering. Before the storekeeper could reply, a long shadow fell across the counter. Ward had stepped inside, silent as a ghost. "That'll do, Jed," he said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the air like a razor. "There's nothing Christian about kicking a body when they're tired." The storekeeper grunted, but wisely said no more. The room was suddenly thick with a tense, dangerous silence. Ward hadn't raised his voice, but the threat was there, coiled just beneath the surface. Lydia felt a shiver run down her spine, a mix of fear and a strange, fierce gratitude. Outside, Ward took the parcels from Lydia without a word, his expression hidden beneath the brim of his hat. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was heavy with things unsaid. That evening, Ward came to the cabin. He was holding a small broom, its handle smooth and new. "If you're set on sweeping," he said, handing it to her, "might as well have the right tool." Lydia broke into a grin, a real, unguarded smile that felt foreign on her face. A warmth bloomed in her chest. She took the broom and swept the floor with a renewed vigor, the new bristles leaving neat, pale stripes in the dust. Her mother sat by the lantern light, mending a tear in a work shirt Ward had left for them. Her stitches were slow but precise. "This is decent of him," she murmured, more to herself than to Lydia. "Decent men are rare." Lydia wanted to shout, "Let's stay here forever." But she just nodded, her new broom held tight in her hands. Later, as the sun bled out along the horizon, Lydia lingered on the porch. She watched Ward cross the yard, his shoulders slumped with the day's labor. "Thank you," she called out softly. He paused and turned. For a moment he just stood there, a dark silhouette against the twilight. Then he nodded once. "Good work in there," he said, his voice carrying on the still air. "Cabin's looking more like a place to live." Lydia beamed. The world felt steady under her feet again. But the steady ground didn't last long. The next morning, the whispers started. Two ranch hands by the water pump went quiet as she approached, their sideways glances sharp as needles. Mabel rode past again, her lips pressed into a bloodless white line. "Folks talk, Ward," she called out, her voice loud enough for the entire ranch to hear. "They see weakness. Give them a reason to think you've gone soft, and they'll take advantage." Ward didn't answer. He just wiped his hands on a rag and stared toward the cabin where Lydia was sweeping, his face a stone mask. That night, when Lydia went to fetch the water Ward always left, she found something else, a small sack sitting on the step. Inside was a heel of bread, a pair of worn leather gloves that were far too big for her, and a folded piece of paper. Her heart pounded as she unfolded it. Scrawled in a rough, masculine hand were 4 words: "Stay a while longer." She clutched the note to her chest, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She looked across the yard to the main house. A single lamp glowed in the window, a small yellow beacon in the vast darkness. She could almost see him there, head bowed, waiting for her to find it. She stepped back inside the cabin, the note pressed flat against her palm. But as the lantern light hit the paper, she saw something else. The note had been written on a scrap, torn from a larger sheet. And on the back, almost faded to invisibility, was different handwriting. A delicate, feminine script. Most of it was illegible, but one fragment stood out, stark and clear in the flickering light. "Forgive me, Sarah." Sarah, a name. The woman who smelled of lavender. Lydia's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a note, it was a message from the past, written on the back of a ghost's apology. And Lydia knew, with a sudden chilling certainty, that they weren't just being offered shelter. They were part of something else entirely, a story of grief and secrets that was far from over. The days that followed fell into a strange, fragile rhythm. Lydia would wake with the dawn, the new broom already in her hand. Each stroke was a prayer, a declaration. "We are here. We are working. We belong." She swept the porch, the path to the well, any patch of ground that looked like it needed tending. She was sweeping a new life into existence. Ward noticed. He always noticed. One morning he found her in the hen house, her small arms wrapped around a basket of eggs so full she could barely lift it. He took it from her without a word, his large, calloused hands gentle. "Eggs break easy," he said, setting the heavy basket on the porch. He looked down at her, his eyes shadowed by his hat. "So do girls." She bristled, thinking he was calling her weak, but then the corner of his mouth quirked up in that almost smile of his, and she understood. It was a warning, but a kind one. From then on, she carried only half the eggs at a time. Her mother's strength returned in small, hesitant increments. First, she was washing their few linens in a kettle over an open fire. Then she was patching a torn sleeve for one of the ranch hands, her needle moving with a slow, remembered grace. Soon, a small pile of mending would appear on their porch step each evening, and by morning it would be gone, replaced by a piece of salt pork or a handful of potatoes. It was a silent, bartered language of need and gratitude. One evening, Ward passed their open door as her mother was finishing a shirt. She pricked her finger and let out a soft hiss of pain. "You should rest," Lydia said, rushing to her side. "I've rested enough," her mother replied, her voice firm. "A body can't just take and take. It ain't right." Ward paused in the shadows just outside the doorway, one hand resting on the frame. He heard her words. Lydia saw his shoulders tense, just for a second, before he moved on, melting back into the night without a word. Some nights he ate supper with them. It was never planned. He would just appear in the doorway as the sun went down, holding a brace of rabbits or a few fish wrapped in paper. He never sat until invited. He never took the first bite until Lydia's mother nodded. The conversation was sparse, clipped. Talk of the weather, the price of cattle, a fence that needed mending. But the silence in between was warm and full. The small cabin, which had once felt haunted and cold, began to feel like a sanctuary. The lantern light pooled on the table, turning the three of them into a small island of warmth against the vast, lonely dark. One evening, as the lantern flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, Lydia found her courage. "Why are you letting us stay?" Ward stared down at his empty plate for a long, long time. The only sound was the chirp of crickets outside. When he finally looked up, his eyes were full of a sorrow so deep it seemed ancient. "Because once," he said, his voice so quiet she had to lean in to hear him, "someone gave me one more day than I deserved." He didn't explain, and they knew not to ask. But the sanctuary of the cabin couldn't keep the outside world at bay. The whispers in town followed them back to the ranch. Lydia would catch the ranch hands, looking at her mother with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Mabel's visits became more frequent, her sharp words always aimed at Ward, but intended for them to hear. "They're a blight on this place, Ward, a reminder of what you lost," she shrieked one afternoon, her face contorted with a grief that had curdled into hate. That night, Ward lingered on his porch long after the sun went down, a solitary figure staring across the yard at their small lighted window. Inside, Lydia's mother folded the last of the mended shirts. "We shouldn't be making trouble for him," she said, her voice heavy. "We're not trouble," Lydia said fiercely. "We work hard." "Sometimes work isn't enough," her mother replied, her eyes distant and sad. The next morning, Lydia found a bucket of whitewash and a thick brush sitting by their door. Ward stood nearby, his boots caked in dust, his hat held in his hands. "Cabin could use a fresh coat," he said, not looking at them directly. "If you feel up to it." Her mother looked at him, startled. Then a slow, determined smile spread across her face. She nodded. They worked all day, side by side. Her mother painted the lower boards, her movements becoming stronger and more certain with each stroke. Lydia perched on a small stool, painted as high as she could reach. Ward moved a ladder for them, steadying it without being asked, his presence a quiet, constant support. The sun beat down on them, but they didn't stop. They were not just painting a cabin, they were claiming it. They were washing away the dust and the sorrow, painting over the ghosts with a bright, defiant white. By sunset, the cabin gleamed like a pearl against the dry, brown earth. It was a declaration. That night, Ward brought over a small, clumsy bouquet of wildflowers jammed into a chipped mug. He set it on the table, his movements awkward, as if he wasn't used to such gestures. "You didn't have to do that," Lydia's mother said, her voice soft. Ward just shrugged, his gaze fixed on the bright splash of color on the simple wooden table. Seemed the place was ready for some color. As he turned to leave, Lydia saw him pause and look at the cot in the corner, the one where his wife, Sarah, must have slept. A spasm of pain crossed his face, so quick she almost missed it. He was letting them bring life back to this place, but it was costing him something too. A few days later, Mabel came again. But this time she didn't stop at Ward's porch. She marched straight across the yard to the gleaming white cabin, her face a thundercloud. Lydia was on the porch, shelling peas into a bowl. "You," Mabel spat, her eyes burning holes into Lydia. "You think you can just move in? Erase her?" Lydia shrank back, the bowl rattling in her lap. This was my sister's home. Mabel's voice cracked, a raw wound of grief tearing through the anger. My Sarah, and you're sleeping in her bed. Using her things. You think sweeping a floor makes that right? Before Lydia could even process the words, Ward was there. He grabbed Mabel's arm, his grip surprisingly firm. Mabel, that's enough. It's not enough, she shrieked, trying to wrench her arm free. He let her die in this very room. He let my niece die. And now he lets you strays, live in their place. It's a desecration. The world tilted on its axis. Niece. There had been a child, a little girl, just like Lydia. Ward's face was pale, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped. Go home, Mabel. His voice was dead calm, but it held a terrifying power. Mabel stared at him, her chest heaving, tears of rage and sorrow streaming down her face. Then her eyes shifted to Lydia, and the hatred in them was so pure, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. He'll fail you too, she whispered, her voice dripping with poison, just like he failed them. Then she turned and fled, her sobs echoing across the quiet ranch yard. Lydia sat frozen on the step, peas scattered around her feet. The whitewashed cabin no longer looked bright and hopeful. It looked like a gravestone. And she finally understood Ward's cryptic words. Someone gave me one more day than I deserved. He wasn't talking about himself. He was talking about the daughter he had lost. The little girl who had once lived in this very room and who hadn't been given one more day. The silence after Mabel's outburst was deafening. Ward stood in the yard, his back to Lydia, his shoulders slumped as if Mabel's words had been physical blows. He looked like a man who had just been condemned. Lydia didn't move. The peas lay forgotten at her feet. He let her die in this very room. He let my niece die. The ugly words echoed in the sudden quiet. A sister, a niece, a wife and a daughter. This wasn't just a sad story, it was a tragedy that was still breathing, its ghost still walking the grounds of this ranch. That night, an unspoken tension hung heavy in the air. Ward didn't bring supper. He didn't light the lamp on his own porch. His house remained a dark, silent shape across the yard. Inside their cabin, Lydia's mother worked on her mending, but her hands trembled. Maybe she's right, she whispered into the flickering lantern light. Maybe we shouldn't be here. Where else can we go? Lydia asked, her voice small. The world outside this ranch was a vast, hungry wilderness. Here, at least, there was a roof. Some roofs aren't worth the price, her mother said, her gaze drifting to the single cot. She didn't have to say the name. Sarah. The next day, Ward was gone before sunrise. The ranch hands moved with a quiet, subdued efficiency, their usual morning banter absent. The whole ranch seemed to be holding its breath. Lydia swept the porch, but her heart wasn't in it. The work no longer felt like a claim, it felt like an intrusion. She was sweeping the dust off another family's tomb. Ward returned late that night, his horse lathered and tired. He didn't go to his house. He walked straight to their cabin. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his face hidden in the deep shadows of the night. Lydia, he said. His voice was raw. Can you come out here a minute? Lydia's mother looked up, her eyes wide with fear. Lydia's own heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood and walked to the door. He didn't look at her. He stared out at the dark line of the horizon. Mabel. She was right about some of it. He took a deep, shuddering breath. This was their home. Sarah's. And our girls. Lily. Lily. A name so close to her own. There was a fever, he said, his voice cracking. It came on fast, the same kind your mother had. I thought she was strong. I went on a cattle drive. Figured it would pass. I was gone 3 days too long. He finally turned to look at her, and in the faint moonlight she could see the glistening tracks of tears on his weathered cheeks. When I got back, it was too late, for both of them. I found them. In there. He gestured vaguely at the cabin. I couldn't save them. I wasn't here. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. This wasn't just grief, it was guilt. A guilt so profound it had hollowed him out, leaving a lonely, haunted shell of a man. I moved into the main house, he continued, his voice a hoarse whisper. I couldn't stand the sight of this place. I locked the door and I let it rot. Mabel's right. I did fail them. And she can't forgive me. I can't forgive me. He looked at Lydia, his eyes pleading. When I saw you, sitting in the dirt with your mother, it was like seeing a ghost. Like God was giving me a second chance, a chance to do it right this time, to be here. The pieces clicked into place, the strange kindness, the haunted eyes, the lavender-scented bandana he must have kept as a memento, the way he knew the fever wasn't the kind that steals a body quick, because he knew exactly how long it took. He wasn't just helping them, he was trying to save the ghosts of his wife and daughter. I'm sorry, he whispered. I never meant to put you in the middle of this. Lydia didn't know what to say. There were no words for a grief that big. So she did the only thing she knew how to do. She stepped off the porch, picked up her small broom, and began to sweep the dirt path in the moonlight. A silent, steady rhythm, a small act of order in a world of chaos. He watched her for a long time. Then he nodded, a slow, tired movement, and walked back to his dark, empty house. Lydia kept sweeping until her arms ached. The whisper of the bristles the only sound in the vast, silent night. They weren't just staying in an empty cabin. They were living inside a man's heart, in the one room he could never bring himself to clean. The confession changed everything. The air on the ranch was still thick with tension, but now it was a tension Lydia understood. Ward's kindness was not charity, it was a desperate act of penance. The gleaming white cabin was not a home, it was a monument to a past he couldn't escape. A few days later, a letter came. The post rider, making his monthly rounds, left it with one of the ranch hands, who brought it to the cabin with a curious glance. It was from a distant cousin of her mother's, back east. A response to a letter her mother had sent weeks ago before the sickness had taken hold, a desperate plea for help. The cousin offered them a place, a room in her crowded house, food through the winter. It was an offer of safety, a way out. That night, Lydia's mother held the letter in her trembling hands, reading the words over and over again by the lantern light. We could go, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Leave all this trouble behind, start over. Lydia's stomach clenched. She looked around the small, clean room, at the curtains her mother had sewn from old flour sacks, at the bunch of wildflowers, now dried and brittle, still in the chipped mug on the table, at the new broom leaning in the corner. Leave? The thought was a physical pain. This place of ghosts and grief had, against all odds, started to feel like home. Lydia couldn't sleep. She lay on her pallet on the floor, staring up at the dark rafters, the cousin's offer echoing in her head. She imagined the cabin empty again, the dust gathering, the silence returning. A restless wind stirred outside, rattling the shutters. She rose and padded to the door, peering out into the moonless night. A single lantern glowed in the middle of the yard, pooling at Ward's feet. He was just standing there, not looking at his house, not looking at the stars. He was staring at their cabin, his hat pulled low, a solitary, waiting figure. Lydia stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air raising goosebumps on her arms. If we go, she asked, her whisper swallowed by the vast darkness, will someone else sweep the floor? Ward looked up, startled. The night kept his face in shadow, but she saw his mouth tighten. She saw the flash of raw pain in his eyes. He was losing them all over again. No, he said, his voice thick, nobody will. She swallowed hard, the crumpled letter from her mother's bedside clutched in her hand. Behind her, her mother stirred in her sleep, murmuring a name from a life-long past. The lantern flickered, casting their two shadows long across the ground. Two lonely figures, standing apart, yet bound together by a house full of ghosts. The letter sat on the table for 3 days, a silent judgment. Each night, Lydia's mother would read it. Each morning, Lydia would sweep the floor with a frantic energy, as if she could scrub the possibility of leaving right out of the boards. Ward said nothing, but his lantern burned later and later each night, a lonely vigil in the dark. On the 4th day, the sky turned ugly. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with a restless energy. By afternoon, the clouds were a mass of dark, bruised purple, and the wind began to hiss through the prairie grass. Ward appeared at their door, his face grim. Storm's moving in fast, he said, his eyes scanning the horizon. I've got to see to the herd in the west pasture. "I'll help," Lydia said, already reaching for her boots. He shook his head, his gaze firm. "You keep your mother inside. This one's bringing lightning." He was gone before she could argue, the sound of his horse's hooves already being swallowed by the rising wind. Thunder cracked, a sound like the sky splitting open. Rain came down in hard, driving sheets, turning the world outside into a blurred watercolor of grey and brown. The wind howled, rattling the cabin as if trying to tear it apart. Lydia lit the lantern, its small flame a defiant speck of light against the roaring dark. Her mother sat on the edge of the cot, her hands twisted together in her lap, her face pale. "We could leave after the storm passes," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the noise. "Go to my cousin's. Start over somewhere quiet." "I don't want quiet." Lydia's throat felt tight. "Not if it means leaving here." "It's not just about what you want, little one," her mother said, but her voice wavered. She was trying to convince herself as much as Lydia. The hours dragged on. The yard turned into a dark, churning river. The storm raged, a wild and violent tantrum. Then, just as a final deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the cabin, they heard it, the desperate pounding rhythm of hoofbeats. Ward staggered into view, a silhouette against the churning grey. He was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his shoulders bowed with exhaustion. He moved like a man twice his age as he tied off his horse and trudged across the muddy yard. When he stepped inside, a pool of rainwater instantly formed at his feet. Lydia rushed forward and pressed a dry blanket into his hands. He just stood there for a long moment, steam rising from his wet clothes in the warm lantern light, his eyes dark and empty. "Cattle are safe," he said at last, his voice a weary rasp. "Lost some fencing, but the herd will hold." Lydia's mother rose from the cot, her movements hesitant. "Ward," she said, her voice careful, deliberate. "We've had an offer. My cousin in the east is willing to take us in." He nodded once, a slow, heavy movement. He had been expecting it. "That's good," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You'll be safe there." Lydia's chest ached. She wanted him to protest, to shout, to give them a single reason to stay. But he didn't. He just turned his back on them, crossed to the hearth, and began to stir the dying embers back to life. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet, the only sounds the drip of water from his coat and the hiss of the rain outside. Lydia looked around the room, at the patched curtains, the broom in the corner, the dried wildflowers. All their work, all the life they had breathed back into this place felt like it was about to be erased. She stood up, picked up her broom, and began to sweep. The floor was already clean, but she swept anyway, back and forth, back and forth. The rhythmic whisper of the bristles filled the silence. She wasn't just sweeping dust. She was sweeping away the thought of leaving, staking her claim one last time. Her mother watched her, her expression unreadable. Ward turned from the fire, leaning one shoulder against the rough-hewn wall. He watched her too, and in the flickering firelight she saw something in his face she had never seen before. The mask of the stoic rancher was gone. All that was left was a man stripped bare, his grief and loneliness laid raw for the world to see. When Lydia finished, she leaned the broom carefully back in its place and stood very still, her small shoulders squared. "You've made this a home," Ward said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know it could be one again." Her mother's breath caught in a soft sob. Ward pushed himself off the wall and walked to the table. He took off his hat and set it down, a gesture of surrender, of laying down a heavy burden. "If you'll stay," he said, his voice low but steady, his eyes finding her mother's in the dim light. "I could use someone who makes a house feel this way." He swallowed hard. "The kind that feels alive." The silence stretched, thick and fragile. The fire crackled. The rain softened to a gentle patter on the roof. Then Lydia's mother crossed the room. She picked up the letter from her cousin. She held it for a moment, then placed it on the table right beside Ward's hat. Slowly, deliberately, she tore it in two, then in four. Lydia let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, a shaky, tear-filled gasp of relief. Ward knelt by the fire, coaxing the flames higher. The warm glow washed over the cabin, softening the corners, turning the patched curtains to gold. It felt like the first sunrise after a long, dark night. Her mother fetched a third plate from their small stack and set it on the table. Her hands were no longer trembling. They ate a simple meal of bread and beans, but it felt like a feast. Lydia laughed once, a bright sudden sound that startled them all, and she saw Ward glance at her, his eyes full of something that looked like wonder, like hope. When the meal was done, Ward stood and reached for his hat. "I'll bring some fresh boards for the porch steps tomorrow," he said. "They're still weak." "Thank you," Lydia's mother said. And for the first time, her voice held no fear, no uncertainty. It was the sound of a woman who was home. After he left, Lydia curled up on her pallet, listening to the gentle drip of rain from the eaves. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and new. Through the window, the stars were beginning to appear, one by one. Her mother stroked her hair. "We're staying," she whispered, as if making a promise to the night itself. Lydia smiled into the darkness. The cabin no longer felt like a tomb. It felt full. It felt like a heart that had decided to keep beating. It wasn't a grand love story or a promise shouted from the rooftops. It was three broken people in a small whitewashed cabin sharing a meal while a storm passed. It was a man learning to forgive himself, a woman learning to trust again, and a little girl who had swept a home into existence. Maybe that's how families are made. Not by blood, but by choice. One small kindness at a time, swept into the corners until there was no room left for the ghosts to settle. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. And let us know in the comments, what's one small act of kindness that changed your life? Thank you for watching.